Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Fettig. I'm a research entomologist with the Pacific Southwest Research Station located here in Davis, California, where I serve on a team of scientists that focus on invasives and threats of forest ecosystems, insects, disease, climate change, wildfire, you name it, we essentially study it. My own personal research program focuses on forest health and disturbance ecology, with an emphasis on bark beetles, climate change, and wildfire. But today I'll be talking a little bit about climate change and adaptive tree breeding. I've had a lot of technical issues this morning, but I'm hoping we've navigated most of those, and so assuming this will work. I do have a lot of information I want to share with you in a relatively short period of time. I do want to spend some time on climate change and climate variability, their impacts on trees and forests, and on stressors and disturbances that shape these important ecosystems over time. Most of my expertise and experience comes from Western North America, so most of the examples I'll share with you today will be drawn from that region. And after that, I'd like to shift gears quite a bit and talk about opportunities for and challenges of tree breeding for climate adaptation and native pest resistance. I think we all recognize by now that the majority of the Earth's surface has warmed during the 20th and early 21st century. Most of that warming has actually been in the northern hemisphere at mid to high latitudes and often at mid to high elevations. So for example, if you look at these graphs here on the right, you'll see why I like to argue that we in Western North America are essentially ground zero for looking at the effects of climate change on natural systems over time. It's where we've observed some of the largest increases in temperature, for example, in the last several decades. The other point I'd like to make is that it's not only getting warmer, it's getting warmer faster than any time in recorded history. In fact, since 2000, 19 of the 20 warmest years on record have occurred, the exception being 1998. This is a table I pulled out of a publication that we contributed to back in 2014, where we were arguing that 2010 was among the warmest. It was either the second warmest after 1998 or tied for the warmest with 2005, depending on which of the three primary data sets here on the left that you use to analyze these types of relationships. Unfortunately for us, as I mentioned, we published this information in 2014, and then 2014 became known as the warmest year on record globally, followed by 2015, followed by 2016. Little departure in those trends in 2017 and 2018. The important distinction there is that that occurred during a La Nina phase. 2019, second warmest year on record. So if you do the math, the warmest years on record since 1880 have all occurred in the last 5 years. I get a lot of questions as to what 2020 is going to look like. Obviously, we still have several months left, but at present, it looks like 2020 will either be the warmest or second warmest year on record globally. These are all observed. These have occurred. We also make projections of future climates. On the left is some information we published in the Journal of Forestry back in 2013, but seems to be tracking very nicely. The left panel is mean annual precipitation, right is temperature, 2050 compared to that climatic normal period of 1961 to 1990. And here our projections are made on median values from 13 different GCMs. Unfortunately for us here in the West, you can see that we're projecting in many areas further reductions in precipitation, somewhere on the order of 5 to 15%, and further increases in temperature, somewhere on the order of 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, again, by mid-century compared to that climatic normal period of 1961 to 1990. Similar, some information on the right from several colleagues published the very same year where they're modeling forest drought severity index, just the amount of drought stress in a forest environment. And here you can see their projections by mid-century are on par with what was observed in 2002 in the southwestern United States. The important distinction there is that was a 1,000-year drought event where we saw large amounts of tree mortality in several different cover types. We're also obviously seeing increases in the growing season. On the left there, some information I took from the Fourth National Climate Assessment, Volume 1. The left there is showing that we've already seen about a 17-day increase in the growing season throughout much of the western United States. But by mid-century, that difference is projected to be somewhere on the order of 30 to 40 days. So large increases in growing season as well. Obviously, that has important implications to the phenology of different vegetation. On the example there on the right is that of Douglas fir, a very important ecological as well as economic species here in the western United States. And you can see here that in future climates, growth of Douglas fir is expected to occur earlier at higher latitudes and elevations. That's pretty intuitive, but actually later at lower latitudes and elevations because the chilling degree requirements will likely not be met for some period of time. In general, how will trees respond to climate change? Well, if we look at specific individuals, some may be unaffected, some may actually be enhanced. There's a lot of examples in the literature where we've pulled a plant out of its climatic niche, put it in a different climatic niche, and it's done quite well. A great example in forestry is that of Monterey pine here, a species native to the central coast of California, where it has a pretty shrub-like form, yet we pluck it out of the ground and move it around the globe to Chile or New Zealand, change the common name to radiata pine, and it becomes a very important timber species. Others will actually acclimate, obviously change their physiology or phenology to adapt to climate change. Some will be maladapted, suffer reduced growth, and others obviously will die. At the population level, some will evolve, others perhaps will migrate, although those mechanisms are probably too slow to account for the very rapid change of climate change that we've observed in the last several decades, and obviously some will go locally extinct. I spent a significant amount of my time the last several years working on the fourth National Climate Assessment. Volume 1 was published in 2017. Volume 2 came out in 2018. And Volume 2 focuses on observed and projected impacts of climate on different sectors and regions of the United States. And the sector that I was associated with was obviously the forest sector. Among other factors in that chapter, we concluded that more frequent extreme weather events will increase the frequency and magnitude of severe ecological disturbances, driving rapid and often persistent changes in forest structure and function across large landscapes. That climate change and climate variability will decrease the ability of many forest ecosystems to provide the ecological goods and services that we've come to expect from them, and that tree growth and carbon storage will be reduced in most locations by chronically higher temperatures, more frequent drought, and increases in the frequency and perhaps severity of disturbances. I would argue that some big changes are coming, but they're actually also happening now. We're actually observing them and measuring them. So for example, we're projecting increases in grassland and montane forest at the expense of the Great Basin woodland and subalpine forest here in the western United States. In fact, a paper I'm fond of, published several years ago now by a colleague with the Rocky Mountain Research Station, suggests that by the end of this century, about 50% of the western U.S. landscape is likely to experience climate profiles with no contemporary analog for the current coniferous vegetation growing there. Very big changes are occurring in very short periods of time. And in the West, most of that is expressed through increases in the frequency and or severity of disturbances. The two most important here, outbreaks of native bark beetles as well as wildfire. Increasingly, these two disturbances are now interacting on our landscape as well. In the interest of time and relevance to adaptive tree breeding, I'm going to focus largely on bark beetles. Very large and diverse group, greater than 6,000 species worldwide, greater than 550 alone. As you might imagine, somebody like me tends to focus on a much smaller subset of that much larger group. And those are species that we consider to be economically important. That is, under certain circumstances like extended drought, they are capable of causing large amounts of tree mortality. And I would argue about 18 species might meet that definition in North America. We also tend to focus on the negative impacts of bark beetles on forests and the ecological goods and services we expect from our forest ecosystem. But I do want to stress that I'm talking about native organisms that under normal circumstances are really critical to the proper functioning of these ecosystems, because they do things like regulate certain aspects of primary production, nutrient cycling, ecological succession, as well as the actual size distribution and abundance of forest trees in many of our different cover types. This is just to give you an indication as to their impact. This is the area impacted by year 2000 to 2016. Here in the western United States only, you can see the gorilla in the room here as represented by that green line, Dendroctonus ponderosa. That's the mountain pine beetle. And you can also see how they compare in terms of impact to wildfire. We burn about 2.8 million hectares annually nationwide. Climate change is having a very big impact on bark beetles. These are poikothermic insects. Shifts in temperature and precipitation affect about everything in their life history. Their fecundity and fitness, their phenology and volatilism, the number of generations that they're able to produce per unit time. But not only themselves, predators, parasites, competitors, other symbionts within these systems. It also affects their ability to find and colonize hosts. Many of these species have very highly evolved chemical communication systems that they use to navigate and coordinate individual attacks and mass attacks on trees. And that can be disrupted by changes in abiotic conditions. And obviously there are important expressions through host tree physiology, which I'll mention more here in a moment. Drought, one of the most important and best recognized inciting factors predisposing trees to colonization by bark beetles here in the western United States. Very well documented in the scientific literature. Short-term deficiencies may result in recurrent infestations of limited scale that occurs quite frequently. Long-term deficiencies may result in large amounts of tree mortality over extensive area, and that's something we're experiencing very recently here in the central and southern Sierra Nevada of California. I'll talk more about that. Why? Well, the reason is when soil moisture becomes limited, a tree really needs to make a very difficult decision, and that is how quickly and how much did they go about closing their stomates to avoid excessive water use. And like anything in life, that decision comes with a cost, and the cost is you're also limiting CO2 from entering the leaf and therefore eventually photosynthesis. So depending on the intensity of drought, the duration of drought, trees may die outright from something we call carbon starvation. They're simply not able to produce enough food to sustain themselves. They may die outright from something we call hydraulic failure, for small bubbles that cause cavitations in the vesicles that, if left unrepaired, prevents the tree from transporting water and nutrients in those vesicles. But in many cases prior to that, we see drought exacerbate other disturbances in the system, bark beetles just being one of the more important and frequent here in the western United States. If we look at the impacts of climate change overall on bark beetle outbreaks, we see intensification of both outbreaks and impacts. In fact, if I consider the data as a whole, I can come up with four grand champions. These are bark beetle outbreaks of a magnitude and or extent we really hadn't seen in recorded history, each with a trigger that we can link to climate change. The first I have listed there is this large mountain pine beetle outbreak. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with that. Several different hosts involved. Greater than 27 million hectares have now been impacted. To put that into perspective, that's an area larger than our 11 smallest states, South Carolina on down combined. There, the inciting factor, an increase in temperatures, but specifically winter temperatures, have allowed a higher proportion of that population to survive the winter and contribute to the next generation. Second example here is spruce beetle on the Kenai Peninsula back in the 1990s in south central Alaska, where that beetle was essentially responsible for killing all susceptible Lutz spruce being a naturally occurring hybrid between Sitka and white spruce in that area of the world. There, the inciting factor, one, it's again an increase in temperature, but specifically summer temperatures have allowed the beetle to skip its facultative diapause, and that allows a portion of the population to go from a 2-year life cycle to a 1-year life cycle, and you can imagine the implications of that to population dynamics over time. The latter two are actually expressed through the host. The first I have listed here is this very large western pine beetle outbreak here in the central and southern Sierra Nevada. In the last several years, about 150 million trees have been killed. The inciting factor there, an interaction between elevated temperatures and drought. To put that into perspective, here in California, 2014 was the hottest and driest on record. 2015 was the third driest and second warmest on record, and as a result of that, we saw large amounts of tree mortality attributed to western pine beetle over a period of several years during and shortly thereafter that drought. Very similar relationship in the desert Southwest when we saw large amounts of tree mortality in the early 2000s associated with that 1,000-year drought event, much of that attributed to an interaction between pinyon nips and elevated temperatures and drought. Again, all bark beetle outbreaks of a magnitude and extent that we hadn't seen in recorded history. I do want to give you an idea as to how rapidly some of these changes can occur. This is some work we're doing in the central Sierra Nevada on the Sierra National Forest. 2014 is just prior to observations of tree mortality. 2016 obviously is 2 years thereafter. You can see we went from about 500 trees per hectare down to 150, about 42 meters square per hectare of basal area, just a cross-sectional area of trees, down to 3. The stem was dominated by large diameter ponderosa pine in 2014. Now it's dominated by small diameter incense cedar and canyon live oak. In fact, if you do the math in a period of 2 years, 70% of the trees and 93% of the basal area were lost. All ponderosa pine were colonized and killed by mountain pine beetle. Climate change is also causing geographic as well as host range shifts. A great example of that is mountain pine beetle. Mountain pine beetle in the early 2000s in interior British Columbia literally got to such high populations that the beetle was lifted into the active airstream and deposited on the other side of the Continental Divide for the first time in history. As best we can tell, they landed in a lodgepole pine forest in 2003, lodgepole pine being one of their primary hosts, did quite well. From there, they entered this zone of hybridization between lodgepole pine and jack pine, and were able to reproduce in those trees. And today, they've been shown to actually be able to reproduce in jack pine. Great example of what I call a native species going invasive. There is a concern here is that perhaps the beetle could use this jack pine land bridge to get across northern North America into the northeastern United States and eventually into the southeastern United States, where we have significant pine resources at risk. But some modeling suggests, or some of the modeling that we've done suggests that that's likely not to occur, at least during this century. In terms of tree breeding and opportunities for climate adaptation, there's quite a few examples to draw from out here. This is one I wanted to share with you. This is some work led by a colleague of mine here at the Pacific Southwest Research Station, Jessica Wright, in collaboration with several of her colleagues here in California, where we're looking at an adaptational lag of temperature in valley oak, a very important species here that's relatively widely distributed throughout the state. And they found as a result of warming that's occurring that the tree is starting to become maladapted, and that further warming under realistic emissions scenarios are likely to lead to further maladaptation to temperature and reductions in growth rate. However, at the same time, they have been able to identify genotypes predicted to grow relatively fast under warmer temperatures, and have demonstrated that selecting seed sources based on their genotype has potential for mitigating some of the negative impacts of future warming on valley oak. So some pretty interesting research being done here. Quite a bit of other examples I could have drawn from. This is the one I thought I'd concentrate on in the interest of time. Much similar work also being done here at the station and elsewhere, looking at drought resistance in both deciduous as well as coniferous tree species. I've been involved in a little work looking at bark beetle resistance, and in general, I would argue that tree breeders have largely ignored opportunities to increase native insect resistance through tree breeding. There's some great examples where we have been successful doing that in reference to invasive insects, invasive diseases, and you'll hear about those from others. In particular in pines, we've recognized that oleoresin exudation pressure is actually predictable and heritable, and potentially could be selected for in tree breeding programs to increase resistance to bark beetles. However, little progress has really been made, and much research really has not actually been initiated. But I do think it's a very fruitful area of future research. There are some examples here. There's been some examples with a closely related weevil species. A lot of people don't realize that bark beetles are actually in the same family as weevils, with white pine weevil resistant spruce seedlings used for reforestation and afforestation up in Canada. How would we go about this in a meaningful way? Well, I think prioritizing based on importance and projected impacts. So, for example, focusing on widely planted commercial tree species, focusing on tree species that are very susceptible to perhaps local extinctions as a result of climate change, and obviously focusing on tree species that are most likely to suffer significant levels of tree mortality in the future. And I'm just sharing a few examples of those with you here that I took from the National Insect and Disease Forest Risk Assessment. And again, if you look at those, you will likely recognize that many of them are primary hosts of the mountain pine beetle. In terms of the mountain pine beetle, we do know that there is interspecific variability in lodgepole pine genotypes, again, one of the primary hosts of mountain pine beetle, that potentially are heritable and could be selected for. There's also interspecific variability in resistance that's been demonstrated. So I do, once again, argue that this is a fruitful area of expertise in terms of adaptive tree breeding overall. We've been doing some work on spruce beetle. Several years ago, we did some modeling to show that it's very likely that the proportion of univoltine beetles as opposed to bivoltine beetles is increasing, and we're now observing that. Again, that's linked to some of the large increases in tree mortality we've seen associated with spruce beetle. One of the things we've been focusing on is trying to understand mechanisms that affect spruce beetle selection and colonization of their host trees, in the end goal of trying to build a better spruce tree, if you will. And so here we're focusing on Engelmann and Bruce spruce. It'll become apparent in a moment as to why. And we're looking at factors like bark reflection and reflectance, tree volatiles, water potential, carbon isotopes, resin flow. Resin flow is one of the primary means by which a conifer protects itself from colonization by bark beetles. Bark thickness, just a physical barrier to entry into the tree by the beetle. Flow and thickness, the resources that beetles actually feed on, as well as phloem terpenoids, several of which at relatively high concentrations can be very toxic to the bark beetles themselves. Much of this work done by a former graduate student of mine at Oregon State University, Dan Ott, who now is with our agency out of Albany. Most of the work we did in Utah and Colorado here, just a little bit about spruce. Spruce, it generally occurs at lower elevations on more mesic sites. Engelmann spruce generally occurs at higher elevations on more xeric sites. They obviously occur in symmetry in certain areas. Engelmann spruce, very technically, I'll define as candy to the beetle. Lots of tree mortality attributed to spruce beetle in our Engelmann spruce forest. Blue spruce, so quite surprisingly, is essentially a non-host. So it's a very good model here to try to study some of these differences. In terms of visual cues, we had a look at bark reflectance of the different species. To make that information meaningful, we had to get an idea as to what the spruce beetle was actually seeing and responding to in terms of wavelengths. Overall, we did find that Engelmann spruce has much higher reflectance values, but as you can see on the right, very similar trends overall between the two species. But that spruce beetle responds to multiple wavelengths of the visual spectrum, including infrared, and as such, it's still unclear to us whether or not this is particularly important. In terms of resin flow, we did find that blue spruce has higher resin flow compared to Engelmann spruce, and therefore higher constitutive defenses against beetle colonization. Again, if heritable, something that potentially could be selected for. In terms of bark thickness and phloem thickness, blue spruce, thicker bark. Again, bark is a physical barrier to entry by the beetle, and Engelmann spruce obviously has thicker phloem here, as you can see on the left. Phloem, a very important nutritional resource that supports developing larvae. Again, if heritable, something that could be selected for in tree breeding programs. In terms of phloem and volatile terpenoids, blue spruce phloem has higher concentrations of some of the most abundant terpenoids, particularly delta-3 carine, which has been shown to be very toxic to spruce beetles and other bark beetles at relatively high concentrations. Engelmann spruce has higher levels of volatile terpenoids emanating from the foliage, and many of these, particularly in the presence of their aggregation pheromone components, tend to be very highly attractive to bark beetles. So again, something, if heritable, that could be selected for. In terms of challenges to adaptive tree breeding for resilient and productive forests, it is difficult, costly, and slow. Each breeding cycle often takes decades, and genetic gains are often modest. We are lacking a lot of basic information and knowledge for many different systems and for many different associations. Going back to the spruce beetle example and Engelmann and blue spruce, we would need a lot of that type of information for a lot of different associations. Suitable tree breeding programs currently exist for only a small fraction of tree species, obviously most of those commercially targeted. Large infrastructures and investments will be required to develop the necessary breeding programs and genomics for many of the other tree species. So again, in short, difficult, costly, and relatively slow. Most species, I do recognize, already have substantial adaptive genetic variability in natural populations. That is, in the end, some of these are just simply in the wrong place, or they're actually being deployed in the wrong place. We do place a lot of emphasis on other aspects of climate adaptation and mitigation in our work, such as assisted migration and obviously active management, and these are also very important. And in the end, we much balance the scale and feasibility of tree breeding solutions versus the scale of the problem we face with climate change. And so I have showed you, some of the observed changes, some of the projected changes, some of those impacts, particularly to the stressors and disturbances that shape these ecosystems over time. We're seeing very rapid changes, and that those are the very issues that we would need to be addressing through these in tree breeding and other activities. There are some practical tools out there. I encourage you to take a look at the seed lot selection tool. Really, it's kind of a climate mapping tool. You can play around, make a lot of different choices here. But what I'm showing you an example here is just showing you how quickly these climates are likely to be changing. This is just a selection for the climatic normal period, and this is what the distribution of those associations are going to look like in 2018 based on RCP 8.5. So again, very large changes are coming. I would argue that foresters that are being born today will be dealing with this level of change during certain aspects of their career. In conclusion, I would argue there's no single right answer here. I do think as a society, we need to become much more comfortable with uncertainty. We should no longer act surprised when we see these large increases in the frequency and or severity of disturbances in many of our forest ecosystems. A lot of emphasis on experimentation and accepting many of the failures along the way. We need to monitor and adjust. Adaptive management is obviously very important here, and to evolve over time. In the interest of time, I'll conclude there. I do want to thank you for the opportunity to participate here in this virtual workshop and leave you with my contact information. Please don't hesitate to contact me if I can be of any assistance to anyone. Thank you.